You're about to embark on a journey into the depths of your own mind, that part of yourself you hide, deny, and fear confronting. But what if you discovered that this inner darkness isn't something to be feared, but rather an untapped reservoir of power and transformative potential? What if the path to becoming truly whole isn't through the light, but through the shadows? Carl Jung, one of the 20th century's most brilliant thinkers, proposed exactly this. He declared, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This challenging statement is the gateway to one of modern psychology's most revolutionary concepts, the shadow. Have you ever wondered why certain people trigger an instant, inexplicable irritation in you, or why you sometimes act in ways that completely contradict your conscious values, or perhaps why certain individuals seem to exert a magnetic fascination over you for no apparent reason? These aren't random coincidences, they're manifestations of your shadow at work. In this video from the Contemplative Path, we'll explore Jung's concept of the shadow, an internal territory that, when navigated properly, can release blocked psychic energy, increase your authenticity, and trigger a profound process of self-knowledge. We'll discover how to recognize your shadow, integrate its aspects rather than repressing them, and transform these hidden elements into powerful allies for your personal growth. The origins of Jung's shadow concept. Before we dive deeper, let's understand the context from which Jung's ideas emerged. Carl Gustav Jung, born in Switzerland in 1875, began as a close collaborator of Sigmund Freud. However, where Freud saw the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed sexual and aggressive impulses, Jung envisioned something far more complex and nuanced. Jung's break with Freud came partly from his conviction that the unconscious contained not just repressed material, but also creative, spiritual, and transformative potential. Through his own profound psychological crisis, what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung developed many of his most influential ideas, including the concept of the shadow. During this period of inner turmoil, Jung engaged in what we might now call active imagination, dialoguing with figures from his unconscious and recording these encounters in his private journals, later published as the Red Book. This deeply personal exploration convinced Jung that the unconscious contained autonomous elements of personality that needed to be recognized and integrated, rather than simply controlled or suppressed. What exactly is the shadow? The shadow, as Jung conceived it, is the part of our psyche that contains all the aspects of ourselves that we repress, deny, or fail to recognize. It's the repository of everything we've deemed unacceptable: traits, desires, impulses, and abilities that our conscious mind has rejected. These rejected parts don't simply disappear. They become autonomous and powerful forces operating beneath the surface of our awareness. Jung observed that we begin forming our shadow in childhood. As we learn what behaviors are rewarded and which are punished, we start to suppress aspects of ourselves that don't receive positive feedback. If expressing anger resulted in rejection, you might have pushed that emotion into your shadow. If vulnerability was met with ridicule, that too might have been banished to your unconscious. What makes the shadow particularly fascinating is that it contains not only our darkest impulses, but also our undeveloped positive qualities. That artistic talent you never cultivated, that leadership ability you were too shy to express. These too become part of your shadow. As Jung put it, "In the shadow is gold." This makes shadow work not just about confronting our darkness, but about reclaiming our wholeness. The shadow is not inherently negative, though it often feels threatening to our conscious identity. It's simply what we've disowned, the parts of ourselves that didn't fit the story we were trying to tell about who we are. This is why Jung insisted that psychological development requires us to make friends with the shadow rather than trying to eliminate it. How the shadow forms. Throughout life, our shadow begins forming in our earliest years, shaped by family, dynamics, cultural expectations, and formative experiences. A child quickly learns which behaviors bring approval and which bring disapproval. The aspects that are discouraged or punished become candidates for the shadow. For example, in a family that prizes intellectual achievement and emotional restraint, a child's exuberant playfulness or intense emotionality might be subtly discouraged. Over time, these natural qualities become repressed and relegated to the shadow. Similarly, in cultures that rigidly define gender roles, qualities associated with the opposite gender are often pushed into the shadow. The shadow continues to form throughout adolescence and into adulthood. Consider the ambitious young professional who suppresses their creative impulses to conform to corporate expectations, or the caregiver who denies their own needs while attending to others. Each compromise with authenticity potentially adds another element to the shadow. Educational systems, religious institutions, and social groups all shape what we consider acceptable or unacceptable about ourselves. Even the most enlightened upbringing involves some level of shadow formation, as society itself requires certain limitations on behavior for functional coexistence. Jung noted that the shadow often contains qualities that would actually be valuable if integrated consciously. The sensitive child who learns to repress emotional responses may lose access to emotional intelligence that would serve them well as an adult. The naturally assertive person who learns to be nice at all costs may lose touch with healthy boundaries and leadership abilities. How the shadow manifests in daily life. The shadow manifests in our lives in three primary ways. First, through projection. We unconsciously attribute our disowned qualities to others. That person who irritates you beyond reason, they're likely displaying a shadow quality of your own. Second, through unconscious behaviors. Those moments when you act completely out of character, often followed by the thought, I don't know what came over me. And third, through dreams and creative expression, where shadow elements often appear as antagonists or troubling symbols. Projection is perhaps the most common way we encounter our shadow in daily life. Jung observed that we tend to be blind to our own shadow qualities, while being hypersensitive to these same qualities in others. This creates what he called the hook, the psychological mechanism by which others seem to hook our emotions by displaying qualities we've disowned in ourselves. Consider the person who is meticulously honest in their conscious life but becomes irrationally angry when they suspect someone else of even minor dishonesty. Their extreme reaction often points to disowned dishonesty in their own shadow, or the individual who prides themselves on their rationality but is inexplicably irritated by someone else's emotional expressiveness, likely pointing to their own repressed emotionality. Unconscious behaviors reveal the shadow when we act, in ways that contradict our conscious values and intentions. The normally mild-mannered person who suddenly explodes in rage, the committed partner who finds themselves inexplicably drawn to infidelity, the dedicated environmentalist who occasionally indulges in conspicuous consumption, all are experiencing shadow eruptions. These moments occur because repressed content requires enormous psychic energy to maintain. Eventually, this tension seeks release, often in inappropriate or ill-timed ways. As Jung noted, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Dreams provide a third window into shadow content. In dreams, shadow elements often appear as figures of the same gender as the dreamer, often threatening, pursuing, or otherwise creating discomfort. These figures represent aspects of ourselves that we've disowned, but that are seeking integration. Recurring dream themes, particularly those involving threat or persecution, frequently contain shadow material, asking for our attention. Signs: your shadow is active. One of the clearest signs of shadow material is an emotional overreaction. When you respond to someone with an intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation, your shadow is likely involved. Similarly, when you feel an inexplicable attraction or repulsion to someone upon first meeting them, shadow projection is often at play. Your shadow also reveals itself in your recurring patterns of self-sabotage and in the criticism you most frequently direct at others. Pay attention to phrases like "I could never" or "I would never." These absolute statements often indicate shadow material. The truth is that as humans we contain all possibilities within us. The capacity for both great kindness and cruelty, both selflessness and selfishness. When we vehemently deny certain capacities within ourselves, we're often pointing directly to shadow content. Another indicator is what Jung called moral perfectionism. the tendency to hold impossibly high moral standards that inevitably lead to failure and shame. This perfectionism often serves as a defense against acknowledging the more complex contradictory aspects of our nature. The shadow can also reveal itself through what therapists call the inner critic, that harsh, judgmental voice that comments negatively on your actions and worth. While we often experience this critic as attacking us, it's actually attacking the qualities in us that we've learned to reject. Our shadow elements. Paradoxically, recognizing this inner critic as partially a response to shadow material can begin the process of integration. Physical symptoms sometimes indicate shadow material seeking recognition. Chronic tension, unexplained pain, or persistent minor illnesses can all be the body's way of expressing what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The field of psychosomatic medicine has documented numerous examples of physical symptoms resolving when underlying psychological conflicts are addressed. The collective shadow in society. Jung's concept of the shadow extends beyond individual psychology to what he called the collective shadow. Just as individuals repress unacceptable qualities, entire societies disown aspects of human nature that don't fit their idealized self-image. Historical witch hunts, scapegoating of minority groups, and demonization of enemy nations all represent collective shadow projections. By attributing unacceptable human qualities to an other, the collective maintains its sense of moral superiority while avoiding confrontation with its own darkness. We can observe collective shadow dynamics in contemporary society as well. The extreme polarization in political discourse often involves mutual shadow projection, with each side attributing the worst possible motivations to the other while remaining blind to similar tendencies within their own group. Jung warned that unacknowledged collective shadow material is particularly dangerous because it can lead to mass movements that enact violent shadow impulses under the guise of righteousness. He lived through the rise of Nazism and observed firsthand how collective shadow projection facilitated atrocity. The antidote to collective shadow, Jung believed, was individual shadow work. If the individual, during his lifetime, had to face the conflicts peculiar to his nature, he wrote, he would have met to a great extent many of today's social problems. Each person who integrates their own shadow contributes to reducing the collective shadow. The consequences of ignoring your shadow. But why should we engage with this uncomfortable inner territory at all? The consequences of ignoring your shadow are significant. Unacknowledged shadow material drains your energy, as repression requires constant psychological effort. It damages relationships when you project your disowned qualities onto loved ones. It limits your potential by keeping valuable parts of yourself inaccessible. And perhaps most importantly, it prevents genuine self-knowledge and authenticity. Repression is never free. It comes with significant psychological costs. Research in modern neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited. Suppressing emotions and aspects of self requires constant vigilance from the prefrontal cortex, depleting cognitive resources that could otherwise be available for creative thinking, problem-solving, and meaningful connection. When we project our shadow onto others, we don't see them clearly. We see aspects of ourselves that we've disowned. This distortion makes authentic relationship impossible. Consider how many marriages end because one partner continues to project their shadow onto the other, creating a relationship with a projection rather than with the actual person. The energy bound up in the shadow represents untapped potential. Jung noted that our greatest gifts often lie adjacent to our deepest wounds, precisely the territory of the shadow. The sensitive child who learns to repress emotions may, if they reclaim the shadow material as an adult, become gifted at emotional intelligence and empathy. The natural leader who was taught to stay in their place may, through shadow work, reclaim their ability to guide and inspire others. Perhaps most significantly, the unexamined shadow prevents us from knowing ourselves truthfully. We remain identified with a partial, sanitized version of who we are, missing the richness and complexity of our full humanity. As Jung put it, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. The process of shadow integration. The process of shadow integration begins with awareness. You must first recognize that your shadow exists and learn to identify its manifestations in your daily life. Start by paying attention to your emotional triggers. What makes you disproportionately angry, anxious, or defensive? These reactions often point directly to shadow material. Jung emphasized that shadow work is not about cerebral analysis, but about emotional honesty. We must be willing to feel the uncomfortable emotions that arise when we confront aspects of ourselves we've tried to deny. This requires courage and compassion toward ourselves. Once we've identified shadow material, the next step is to examine its origins. When and how did we learn to reject this aspect of ourselves? What messages did we receive from family, education, religion, or culture? Understanding the context in which our shadow formed helps us approach it with greater compassion. Integration doesn't mean uncritically embracing every shadow impulse. Rather, it means bringing these elements into conscious relationship. Some shadow aspects may need healthy expression, while others may need conscious containment. The key is that we're no longer unconsciously driven by them. For example, someone who has repressed their anger might learn to express it in appropriate ways rather than having it leak out in passive-aggressive behavior or explode in disproportionate rage. Someone who has disowned their vulnerability might learn to selectively share their feelings in trusted relationships rather than maintaining a brittle facade of invulnerability. Practical tools for shadow work. Journaling is a powerful tool for shadow work. Try writing with your non-dominant hand to access less conscious material. Record your dreams, which often contain shadow elements in symbolic form. Practice honest self-reflection by asking, "What traits do I most despise in others?" And consider how these might be projections of your own disowned qualities. Another effective approach is to examine your judgments. When you find yourself harshly judging someone else, pause and ask, "How might this quality also exist within me?" This doesn't mean your judgments are never valid, but it opens the possibility that they contain valuable information about your shadow. Active imagination, the method Jung himself developed during his own psychological crisis, offers a direct way to engage with shadow material. This involves entering a meditative state and dialoguing with figures from your unconscious. You might visualize a shadow aspect as a character and have a conversation with it, asking what it wants and what it has to teach you. Artistic expression provides another pathway to the shadow. Creating without censorship, whether through visual art, movement, music, or writing, often allows shadow elements to emerge in symbolic form. Pay attention to the themes, characters, and imagery that appear in your creative work, especially those that surprise or disturb you. Body-centered approaches recognize that shadow material is often held somatically. Practices like yoga, Tai Chi, or authentic movement can release tensions and emotions stored in the body, bringing shadow aspects into awareness. Notice where you hold tension and what emotions arise when you focus attention on these areas. Working with dreams is central to Jungian shadow work. Keep a dream journal and look for recurring characters, situations, or emotions. Pay particular attention to dream figures that disturb you or to situations where you feel pursued or threatened. These often represent shadow aspects seeking integration. Shadow work in relationships. Relationships provide some of our most potent opportunities for shadow work. Our closest connections often trigger our shadow material, both through projection and through the intimacy that makes it harder to maintain our carefully constructed personas. Pay attention to patterns in your relationships. Do you consistently attract partners with certain problematic qualities? Do your relationships end for similar reasons each time? These patterns often indicate shadow projection. We unconsciously seek out people who carry our disowned parts. The practice of owning the projection can transform relationships. When you find yourself strongly reactive to someone, try this experiment. Imagine that the quality triggering you is actually your own, and speak about it in the first person. For example, instead of "he's so controlling," try "I can be controlling." Notice how this feels and what insights it brings. Intimate relationships offer a unique opportunity for what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. When conflicts arise, rather than immediately trying to resolve them, can you stay present with the discomfort and examine what shadow material might be activated? Often, Relationship conflicts involve mutual shadow projection, with each partner triggering and responding to the other's disowned aspects. Shadow work doesn't just apply to romantic relationships. Family dynamics, friendships, and work relationships all reflect shadow material. The difficult colleague, the challenging family member, the friend who inexplicably irritates you, all may be mirrors reflecting aspects of your shadow. The shadow and creativity. Jung observed a profound connection between the shadow and creativity. Many artists, writers, and musicians intuitively understand that their creative power emerges from engagement with the aspects of themselves that don't fit neatly into social conventions. Great art often emerges from the tension between the conscious and unconscious mind, exactly the territory of shadow work. Consider how many renowned creative works explore themes of the double or the doppelganger, from Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to Dostoevsky's The Double. These stories externalize the psychological reality of the shadow. Creative blocks frequently indicate shadow material seeking expression. When we try to create only from our conscious, socially acceptable self, we access only a fraction of our creative potential. Allowing shadow elements to inform our creative work often leads to breakthrough moments of originality and authenticity. Jung himself used creative expression as a method of shadow integration. During his period of inner crisis, he created mandalas, built stone structures, and engaged in what we might now call art therapy. These activities provided containers for psychological material that was too complex for rational analysis alone. If you're engaged in creative work, consider how your shadow might be seeking expression through your creation. What themes recur in your work? What characters or elements emerge that surprise you? These often point to shadow material asking for integration through creative expression, the shadow and the individuation process. Shadow integration is not a standalone process, but part of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey toward psychological wholeness and authenticity. Individuation involves differentiating yourself from collective norms and expectations while simultaneously recognizing your connection to the collective unconscious. In the individuation process, shadow work typically comes first. Before we can engage with deeper archetypal material, we must address our personal shadow, the aspects of ourselves we've disowned within our lifetime. This creates the psychological foundation for deeper exploration. Jung observed that individuation has different emphases in different life stages. In the first half of life, we establish our identity within social structures, inevitably creating shadow material in the process. The second half of life offers the opportunity to reclaim this shadow material and develop a more complete sense of self. The midlife transition often brings shadow issues to the fore. The persona developed in early adulthood may begin to feel constraining, while repressed aspects clamor for expression. This can manifest as what we call a midlife crisis, but from a Jungian perspective, it represents an opportunity for growth through shadow integration. Jung believed that individuation is never complete but continues throughout life. As we integrate aspects of our shadow, new layers of unconscious material become accessible. This creates a spiral of ongoing development rather than a linear progression with a fixed endpoint. Shadow work and the inner critic. One of the most challenging aspects of shadow work involves confronting the inner critic, that internalized voice of judgment that maintains the boundary between our conscious identity and our shadow. This critic often disguises itself as the voice of reason, morality, or self-improvement, while actually perpetuating psychological fragmentation. The inner critic develops as we internalize external judgments about which aspects of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. Over time, we no longer need external authorities to enforce these boundaries. We've installed the judge within our own psyche. Working with the inner critic requires subtle awareness. Direct confrontation often strengthens it, while uncritical acceptance allows it to continue limiting our wholeness. The most effective approach typically involves bringing compassionate awareness to this voice, recognizing its protective intent, while gently questioning its absolute authority. Try dialoguing with your inner critic through writing or imagination. Ask what it's trying to protect you from. Often you'll discover that this harsh voice developed as a strategy to keep you safe from rejection or failure. Acknowledging this, protective intent can begin transforming your relationship with the critic. At the same time, recognize that the critic's strategies are often outdated. The rules it enforces may have been necessary for childhood survival, but now prevent adult flourishing. With compassion for both the critic and the criticized parts of yourself, you can begin renegotiating these internal relationships. The shadow. And spirituality. Jung observed that authentic spirituality involves confronting rather than bypassing shadow material. He was critical of spiritual approaches that emphasized only light, love, and positivity while denying the reality of human darkness. True spiritual development, he believed, requires engaged relationship with all aspects of the psyche. Many spiritual traditions contain wisdom about shadow integration, though they use different terminology. Buddhist practice involves facing one's delusions and attachments rather than transcending them through bypass. Christian contemplative traditions speak of the dark night of the soul as a necessary spiritual passage. Indigenous traditions often